Okay, JavaScript has become dangerous. It's now used for much more than it was ever intended for. You see it everywhere. And then the thing is, how can we make it better for those tasks? And that is kind of the basic motivation behind ECMAScript 6. And it's the current version of ECMAScript is ECMAScript 5. The next one will have the number 6. And in this talk, we'll cover the goals for it, the design process, how it is created, its features, and I'll also tell you when you'll be able to use it. And the usual caveat applies. Everything I tell you is preliminary. It's still work in progress, so features can and will change. First, a little background. There are a few terms that you need to know in order to understand the whole ECMAScript 6 universe. And the first one is TC39. Who has heard that word before? Okay. So this is basically it's the committee that evolves the language. Members of that committee are companies, and they send delegates to attend meetings. The meetings are also attended by invited experts, so it's a mix of people, and they vote and decide and discuss when it comes to new features. Then there is the difference between ECMAScript and JavaScript. Who knows what the difference is? Hand up. Okay. So the problem is that there is a trademark for Java owned by originally Sun and now Oracle, which is why only Mozilla is allowed to call its implementation of JavaScript actually JavaScript, and which is why Microsoft's JavaScript is called JScript officially. So when they were in the process of creating a standard, they couldn't use the name JavaScript, they had to invent something new. And because the standards organization that hosts the standard is called ECMA, they just picked the name ECMAScript. So ECMAScript is kind of the official name for JavaScript that doesn't have any trademark problems. But apart from that, everyone calls it JavaScript. And when you read the specification, it's always the ECMAScript specification. And when it comes to versions of the language, you say ECMAScript 5, and it's immediately clear that it's a version of the language specification. So then there's one last term, and that is ECMAScript Harmony. And that is an umbrella term for future JavaScript. So it comprises ECMAScript 6 and ECMAScript 7. So you may have, who has heard ECMAScript Harmony before? So that is kind of, you may have, and if you see it, it's kind of like the future, the upcoming next two versions. So what are the goals? TC39 wants to make JavaScript better for complex applications, because now sometimes you have JavaScript apps with millions of lines of code, which just, if you look at the beginnings with the humble on-click beginnings, then that's really, really amazing. And the language originally was never created to handle that many lines of code. So that's one of the goals. The second goal is to make it better for libraries, and that includes the DOM, which does some weird things. And at the moment, you cannot emulate all of those things in JavaScript in the language itself. So you need to add new mechanisms that allow you to completely mimic the DOM. And you also want to make it a better target for code generators, because there's now an incredible amount of languages being compiled to JavaScript. And some people hate JavaScript so much that they're actually hoping that in a more faraway future, nobody will have to code in JavaScript, and it'll be like the assembly language of the web. But ECMAScript 6 is good enough that it'll be fun to actually program in JavaScript. Well, as it already is, actually. So how are ECMAScript features designed? And one of the worries when you hear the word committee is that you'll have design by committee. And TC39 avoids that by doing so-called design by champions. And what those people do is it's usually a group of 1 to 2 people, and the less people that are responsible for design, the better it gets usually. So Fred Brooks, the author of the Mythical Man Month, once said that actually the best way to do design is to have one person who is really in charge. At the most, maybe 2, but then one of the 2 better be the dominant one. So the champion or the champions write a strawman proposal that's a rough sketch of the new language feature that they want to add to the language. Then if TC39 is interested, a more full-featured proposal is written, and afterwards, and this is a very important step, you will have field testing in browsers, and then they can figure out if it's actually useful. People will use it to write libraries, will use it in their code, and in daily usage, often things come out that would never come out from just reading the proposal. So after field testing, improvements are made to the proposal, and finally, if TC39 accepts the feature, it will be included in a draft of the language specification, and if the draft becomes final, then it's actually a standard feature. So you have, if you look at other languages such as Python, which, well, recently or not so recently had an upgrade, a considerable upgrade to Python 3, and it made, in a few ways, it made a very clear cut with the past. And the problem is, with JavaScript, you can't do that, because when you add new features to existing engines or existing browsers, it's like a forced upgrade for everyone. So kind of the mantra behind adding new stuff to JavaScript is don't break the web. And so they're trying to, and usually it'll be that it's completely new syntax so that it doesn't clash with existing code. And then if the engine is new enough, then you can just use the new code, and existing code won't break. But then, so for engines, it's still kind of okay. But if you want to write ECMAScript 6 code, then you do have a problem, because you can't. It'll take a long while. At the moment, you kind of can assume that ECMAScript 5 is being supported, and that took years. And for ECMAScript 6, it'll probably also take years. So if you want to write code in ECMAScript 6, you'll have to come up with a solution, and we'll talk about how to do that at the end of the talk. So first, let's look at variables and scoping. So the traditional JavaScript scoping is function scoping. So here you think you have something, if you're coming from another programming language, you think that you have something local, but you don't. It still exists down there. And the reason for that is that everything you declare exists in the innermost enclosing function. So what ECMAScript 6 gives you is let, and that's the new var, and it lets you. And whenever you declare a variable with let, it only exists inside the block. And down here, you get a reference error because temp is unknown and really block local. And that also means that, who of you know IFEs? this kind of function that is immediately invoked. You write as kind of simulating block scoping. So what an IFI is you simulate block scoping, and you write a function, you immediately invoke it, and then you kind of have a tight area in which new variables can be created. And with let, you won't need IFIs anymore. A normal block will be enough. So then you have destructuring, which is a new way of assigning. And so if you have an object with two properties, and you want to extract two values at the same time, what you do is, instead of a variable name when you have an assignment, you use a pattern on the left-hand side, and then that allows you to extract. So in this example, you want to extract the value of the property first and the value of the property last, and this pattern allows you to do that at the same time, which leads to kind of more compact code. And later on, it's useful for much more. We'll see later on why. So you can use it for variable declarations when you do an assignment. So here it's used for a variable declaration when you do an assignment, and for parameter definitions where it allows you to do some cool stuff. Same thing for arrays. Here you have an array with two elements. You have a pattern at the left-hand side, and x and y get the values of the first element and of the second element. And you can also do this is a rest operator. You can also extract the rest. So in this example, x is a, y is b, and rest and the variable rest holds c and d in an array, as you can see down here. And then you can also do this quick hack. If you want to swap values without a temporary variable, this is how you do it. And destructuring, just very quickly, is refutable by default. And what that means, it's kind of a weird word. What that means is that things fail. There is an exception if the requirements of the left-hand side aren't met. So here, the left-hand side demands A and B, and if the object at the right-hand side doesn't have B, then an exception is thrown. And the way around that is if you prepend a question mark, you can omit B becomes optional. You can also specify a default value. So if B is missing, Y gets the value 5 by default. Arrow functions. The problem with functions or function expressions is that they're used everywhere. And that leads to a lot of unnecessary code. Here you have the fairly long function keyword, and Brendan Eich, JavaScript's creator, once said that if he could go back in time, he would actually make it fn, something much shorter. And then you have the return, where I actually only want to kind of, it'd be nice to only use an expression here. So a lot of syntactic noise, and with arrow functions, it's much shorter. So you write this, and for if you use for each loops or similar constructs, or especially if you do asynchronous programming, there will be much less syntactic noise. Another advantage is that if you use functions, they play many roles at once, and it's a bit problematic that a function is both used for methods and for non-method functions, for normal functions. So the problem you have then is that here you are in a constructor, and down here you have a function, but you use it as a real function, not as a method. But unfortunately, because functions can also be methods, they come with their own this, which in this case is totally useless. So this is shadowed, and what people usually do is if you want to access the this of the surrounding constructor or method down here, you assign it up there to a different variable, and this kind of gets around the shadowing. And this is bad, and even experienced people often get it wrong. Just recently, someone really smart talked about a severe bug that he had in code, and that was this kind of problem, just the shadowing of this, just forgetting, writing this.handle, click down here, and then have it explode in the code. With arrow functions, they don't have their own this. They are real and true functions. They have one dedicated task, and that is to be that. And down here, if you use an arrow function, you just write this.handle click, and this is not shadowed, and you're fine. The different ways of defining arrow functions, the general form is arguments in parentheses. You get a shorter version that we've already seen, and that is if you have a single parameter, you get this more compact thing here that we've seen here. Parameter handling. At the moment, parameter handling in JavaScript is fairly cumbersome. You've all used arguments, right? Hands up. Yeah. So as soon as it comes to default parameters or any kind of more sophisticated you want to do, then you're stuck with arguments, which is basically something array-like. And you have to access parameters via indices, and it's just not very pleasant. And almost every other language allows you to provide default values when you omit a parameter, and JavaScript is fairly Spartan in this area. So this is an example, and it should be immediately obvious what it does. It has two parameters. Y. The second parameter is optional. If you omit it, y gets the value 3. And here you can see that if you provide both values, you get 1 and 2. Then if you only provide 1, y gets the default value. And if you omit both, you get the typical behavior of x being undefined. So x is still kind of optional, and the minimum you'd love to be a minimum arity to be enforced and to be this an error if you omit x2, but you can't do that because you don't want to break the existing web. So, but this is fairly good. Then you have rest parameters. We had to be a bit tricky with arguments too now if you want to do it. And here, for example, you have kind of the first argument, and then you want the remaining arguments to be in an array. And this just, the function returns the array, and then you can see that in this case, 0 is assigned to arg0, and 1 to 3 become an array, and so on. So this is also well known from other languages. And the inverse of the rest operator is the spread operator, and it kind of obviates the need for apply. So you have the math max function. Who of you have used math max? And so it's kind of it's simple. You give it several parameters, and it returns the maximum, the highest number among those. But the problem is that manually specifying that is pretty boring. The max function is most interesting for arrays, And at the moment, you can do that via apply. And with the spread operator, and Python has that as well, you just hand in an array, and it turns the array into parameters. Then you have, well, almost named parameters. And this is a common pattern already. The problem is, if you have more than one parameter, it becomes kind of unclear. It tends to become unclear what all the parameters are for. So especially if you have numbers. So if you imagine a function call and you have the numbers 1, 6, 7, and 8, then what the heck are those things for? Is it you can't tell. And other languages have convenient syntax that makes it more obvious what the parameters is for. JavaScript so far doesn't have that. And a very often used pattern is to just use an object literal, and then you get nice labels for the parameters. And you don't have to wonder what A and B is for because they're labeled. And if you did this for numbers, you'd have X, Y, and Z, or Z, and you'd immediately read the source code, and you wouldn't have to refer to the documentation in order to figure out what the parameters are for. And just as an aside, Smalltalk always only has labeled parameters, and that makes Smalltalk source code very easy to read. And here's where destructuring is really, really awesome, because, and this is an abbreviation, this is a kind of a shortcut notation where where if you write opt1, comma, opt2, this is a shortcut for opt1 colon opt1, opt2 colon opt2. So it uses the variable name also as the property name. And that way you can just very conveniently, very quickly extract the data from this second parameter. And they thought about adding true name parameters, but due to this nice way of extracting stuff, you don't need it. And under the hood, JavaScript engines can optimize so that it's really fast. Next, object orientation. There are a few upgrades for object literals. First, you have the underscore, underscore, proto, underscore, underscore, and the way to pronounce that is dunder for double underscore. Well, it comes from Python, again. And so this is dunder proto, and the obvious next joke is like the dunder Mifflin. So dunder proto allows you to set the prototype of an object, which, well, that's fairly advanced stuff. But if you need to do it, it's kind of convenient not to have to use object create. And then you have a much more compact way of defining methods. And if you are already a JavaScript programmer, which I'm assuming everyone is, then you've kind of gotten used to this, that you usually write my method colon and then you write function. But if you're new to the language and if you take a step back, that's actually a very strange thing to do, because you define a method and then you say function. Why? I mean, that's weird. And so here you have something that takes JavaScript programmers a little while to get used to, but is very natural for people who are new to JavaScript. And we need to kind of please those people too, because, well, as I said before, there's still an immense amount of hatred for JavaScript out there. And I like it. It makes object literals more compact. And this is what you would do in ECMAScript 5. You would do an object create, and then you would assign my method. And so this is keeps everything together in one place, so it's neater. Yeah, and then you have this shorthand I mentioned before. So X and Y is a shorthand for this one, and X just says the name of the variable, and the property name is the same. And you can use it to return multiple values, which is cool. You don't need it often, but when you need it, it's a tiny bit, well, there's a bit of boilerplate involved. And with ECMAScript 6, things become more compact. So here you just want to return two numeric values. And thanks to the shorthand, you just write X and Y in curly braces. And thanks to destructuring, you can extract them just as easily. And the nice thing is that you could just as easily swap X and Y. So the order doesn't matter here, because you're really extracting stuff from an object literal. Then you have symbols that are very similar to strings, and the main advantage of a symbol is that it prevents clashes. And at the moment, TC39 is adding new methods to existing constructors in JavaScript. And some of the names are already taken, some convenient names. And existing code breaks in weird places that already uses the name, and TC39 can't foresee all of those instances. So that constrains you when you add new properties. And it becomes even more complicated if you do mix-ins. And these are pieces like object fragments that you add to your constructor, to the prototype of your, well, terminology, to the instance prototype. And there again, name clashes are a huge, huge problem, especially for private stuff. So these are just names that never clash with anything. And there is new syntax that allows you to do that. So in here, this is kind of like a special string. And the square brackets here for the property name allows you, and in here you can compute. You could also have a function call or do, say, add two strings. That's another possibility. But instead, you're kind of referring to a symbol, and then the symbol becomes the property key. And with that special name, you'll never, ever have clashes. Classes. And those are a controversial feature. Who of you kind of think that it's a good thing to have classes? Who kind of think that they're not necessary, that we're fine as we are? Okay, who of you doesn't have an opinion? Okay. So the thing is that classes are actually not, in and of themselves, they're not that important, because what we have at the moment is not that bad. The main problem comes from two fronts. If people are new to JavaScript, they see constructors for the first time, they usually freak out. Once you learn them, you're usually fine. Things become complicated again if you do inheritance, if you want to create a subconstructor, if you want to subclass. Actually, then it's 3 points why they're good. So for newcomers, they're good. For subclassing, they're awesome, because there's a ton of weird libraries out there that help you with that. And the third thing is, for portability, they're excellent. Because if you look at all of the frameworks, almost every framework does its own thing when it comes to inheritance. And everybody and their dog has implemented some kind of inheritance API. So, and that makes code incredibly unportable. If you have something you write for Ember, you use their way of doing inheritance, and if you want to port it to, say, Angular, you're stuck. And with classes, much, maybe not all, because sometimes you do data binding too in these libraries, but much of that will change, and that will make code much more portable. So this is the way you write a class, and it's not that dramatically better. So you see, it's still the constructor sets up the instance, and then you have prototype methods, and a class just ties all of that together into a single construct. Things get more interesting when you do subclassing, and here you have color point, which is a subclass of point, and then you have something that's new with super, which invokes the super constructor, and you again call the super method down here. And this is a huge improvement now, because here you kind of have to, this is the code as you would write it right now in ECMAScript 5. And even to see what color point is a subclass of or a subconstructor of is, you need to dig down here to find that out. And don't even get me started on the super call. So this is nasty down here. So super is great to have. This kind of built-in subclassing is great to have. And you'll also be able to subclass built-in constructors such as array, date, and so on, and which is currently not possible. And the other thing is that under the hood, this is still translated to a constructor. So you're still backwards compatible. And under the hood, nothing changes, which is both a good and a bad thing. You stay familiar, but there's now a certain kind of disconnect, because this looks more like the prototype than actually the constructor. So it's kind of counterintuitive that this would become a function. Then you have static methods. Well, OK. So if you prefix static, then this becomes a method of the constructor. Modules, that's another big deal. And again, you have, well, actually 3 factions, not just 2. You have 3 factions. One faction says that what we have is good enough, and we do have very good module systems in JavaScript. The second faction says we need something new, something more convenient, and the third faction doesn't have an opinion. So but again, the main problem is that while we have 2 competing module systems at the moment, so one of them is AMD. That's very popular in the web world, and then you have Node.js modules that via Browserify are now also used in the client, but that's an extra compilation step. So that's, and I don't like compilation steps. And there's a split. So there are people who are fans of AMD. There are people who are fans of Node.js modules. And it's painful because you would want JavaScript to have a single module standard. So that's actually kind of the biggest benefit of ECMAScript 6 modules is that it kind of brings those 2 factions together. And the way you write those modules is very, very similar to Node.js modules. Who has written a Node.js module already? OK. So this is, and what you do is you write your code as you would just a fragment that several constructs. In here, you have a let declaration, you have a function declaration, you define a constant, and then stuff you want to export, you simply prefix the keyword export. And that, compared to current module systems, be it AMD, be it Node.js, it eliminates some redundancy. Because very often you'd kind of repeat the name square down somewhere in Node.js to export it. And if you want to use that module, then you say, well, I want to import, and this is a module identifier. I want to import that module, and I want to import several things, but I'm only interested in one of its exports, and that is square. And then you can use square as the function that it is. The alternative is to import the whole module as an object. The object is called math. You could pick any name. And then you use square as a method of math. And the nice thing is it eliminates global variables mostly from the JavaScript world. So this is kind of global because you need unique names to refer to modules, but any kind of math is local, square is local, so the contents of the module stay local, and you don't have this kind of, because at the moment, if you introduce a new feature in the browser, be it, for example, web worker or whatever, any kind of new browser API introduces something, a new global identifier. And there you always have the risk of clashing with something that already exists. So, template strings are neat too. They allow you to insert, to do this kind of interpolation thing that you may know from the shell or from Perl or from Python. So a lot of other programming languages support that. So this makes it easy, or from templates too. This makes it easy to insert stuff. And you can also tag it. You can give it a tag. And that allows you to kind of create new literals for specific features. So there are many applications for that. You can, if you have your own query language, you can make it easy to automatically escape stuff you insert. You could say implement an extended regular expression syntax, and then insert something that will be automatically escaped, and so on. And it has many applications, and one really cool application is you get multiple lines and no escaping if you want. This is a custom tag. So again, the tag here means that a function is being called with the fixed parts first in an array, and then the variable parts afterwards, and that allows the function template handler to do something special with these dynamic parts and handle the fixed parts differently. And this is one such function, and what it allows you to do is you can use multiple lines in a string literal, and you don't have to escape. So this is really a backslash followed by an n. It's not a new line. And this comes in handy for regular expressions. So regexp is a really cool regular expression library. And for example, it allows you to name groups and to refer to groups by name and not by number in a regular expression. And here, you get to kind of draw things out, and you have one construct per line. White space is ignored. And you can also comment the parts of a regular expression. And thanks to template strings, you don't, this backslash dot, this is a backslash of a regular expression. And if you use strings for that, you have to escape the backslash because it's inside a string. And, well, new lines, you don't have to add new lines here. So the same thing with, in current JavaScript with the same library is you have to add these strings, you have to add new line, and you have to escape the backslash here. So it allows you to, these kind of sub-languages, and regular expression is kind of an embedded language if you think about it. These sub-languages are easier and nicer to implement with template strings. So for templating, again, they're also useful for if you for text localization. They're useful for query languages and so on. The standard library gets a few gets new functionality. It's currently very Spartan, and so for example, who of you have used _JS? So that's a highly recommended library that kind of fills the holes in current JavaScript. And ECMAScript 6 gets a few new things, but underscore is still important. And map is finally a map that allows you to map arbitrary values to arbitrary values. At the moment, you can only kind of abuse objects to map strings to arbitrary values. Sets are collections of arbitrary values. Various other things. You can repeat strings several times. You can check whether a string starts with another string. And it seems like a small thing, but I very often in the past wished that JavaScript had actually that. And various other things. Okay, we're running out of time, unfortunately. The timetable. So, or just very quickly, you will get a nicer loop, and you will be able to implement your own iterators. So if you write your own collections, they will automatically work with this loop. So at the moment, you kind of have for in, but for in has its problems, and this is kind of the loop that for in should always have been. So when will things be ready? The ECMAScript specification, that the final draft will be written in November 2013. In July 2014, it will be editorially complete, feature complete, if you want. And by December 2014, it will be approved by ECMA. But the thing is that features already turn up in browsers, and in the coming months, you will already be able to use some of the new features. But the problem is that you can't rely on the browser, on all browsers to support those features. So what you want is compilation. And there's several really nice solutions out there. And I think the most important one is TypeScript. Who of you have heard of TypeScript? And it's really good technology. It's open source. It's by Microsoft. It's based on Node.js. It's cross-platform, and it's, well, open source, and it's also free. So, and it's supported by, for example, by WebStorm in addition to Microsoft's own tools, and WebStorm is fairly affordable. And what TypeScript is it's basically ECMAScript 6 plus optional typing. And so if you want, you can even completely forget about the type annotations. So with a dot, for example. So you can write a function and then x dot number. You can type the parameter like you can in static languages, in statically typed languages. But if you can completely forget about that feature and then just use ECMAScript 6 already. And it compiles fairly nice code. So it compiles ECMAScript 6 to ECMAScript 5. And then in addition, you have source maps. And source maps enable you to debug code that is compiled to JavaScript in the original as opposed to the compiled code. So with source maps, for example, you can have minified code and run minified code, but the debugging, the error messages and so on, the line numbers and everything refers to the original JavaScript, not to the minified ugly JavaScript. And the same thing you can do with TypeScript. So you can, so it feels like you're already running ECMAScript 6 in the browser. All the debugging happens in the original, and you get to use a much more convenient language. In addition, you have Tresor that also does this compilation thing, but it's a bit behind when it comes to some of the features. And then additionally, you have a smaller solution, and that is just the additional that just gives you the new built-in stuff that comes with ECMAScript 6. You can use it already. So the string repeat, the string starts with, you'll be able to use that in ECMAScript 5, thanks to this kind of library, a shim, a so-called shim. OK, so when it comes to ECMAScript 6, what are the takeaways? It's already in browsers. You will have complete support by the end of 2014. Thanks to TypeScript and similar technologies, you can already use it today. And the biggest impact on the community are classes and modules, because it unifies the community. And then and at the moment, NPM, the module or package manager for Node.js, is really convenient because you have a repository of modules, and you can. There's a lot of stuff out there, and with NPM you can install it conveniently. But again, it only works so well in the browser, and there's still not everything is on NPM. Some stuff is only on Bower, another package manager. And so ECMAScript 6 will bring the community together when it comes to classes and when it comes to modules, which is great. All right, thank you.